After leaving the Galapagos, the Beagle sailed for home by heading west and continuing its trip around the world. Along the way, with stops in Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, Darwin had a look at still other ecosystems, each with its own specific animals, plants, and insects that seemed well suited to each specific place where they lived. In October of 1836, the Beagle finally sailed into home port at Falmouth, ending a voyage of nearly 5 years. Darwin rushed home to the Mount, surprising his sisters and mother and father as they were eating breakfast. All were overjoyed to see him, and all were impressed with how Charles had changed from an unfocused student to a worldly man of science. His father declared, "Why, even the shape of his head is quite altered." Darwin's position in the world had also changed. Now his name was becoming well known throughout English scientific society. Some of the specimens Darwin had shipped to England over the years of his journey had already been studied and catalogued, and several species new to Western science were among them. Charles and Captain Fitzroy capitalized on the fame of their discoveries by writing 2 books filled with illustrations about their voyage of discovery. With the backing of family resources and a grant from the government, Darwin was able to spend the time he needed to study in detail the specimens he had collected. But he was no expert on the classification of species. So for help classifying birds, he sought the advice of John Gould, a leading ornithologist of that time. Darwin had thought the mockingbird specimens he brought back from the Galapagos were probably simple variations of the same basic species. After all, they seemed so closely related even though the differences were clear. Gould examined the specimens and declared that all of the knowledge of ornithology would have to be thrown out if birds as different as Darwin's mockingbirds were thought to be only varieties and not entirely separate species. This was dramatic news for Darwin. If the expert Gould was sure that these were not varieties, but were in fact 3 separate and distinct species of mockingbird, then how did 3 separate species come to be in such a small space as the Galapagos? Did it make sense that God would bother to create so many different species in one small place? Or was there some other process at work? Maybe a natural ongoing process that led to the formation of different species? With this idea in mind, Darwin now looked back over his other specimens, especially his Galapagos finches, since the finches showed such clear deviation in the form of their beaks. But Darwin had also made mistakes classifying the finches. He thought the warbler finch was a wren, the large ground finch a grosbeak, and the cactus finch a type related to orioles or blackbirds. When Gould pointed out that all these birds were, in fact, separate species of finch, Darwin began to wonder if these birds had once been related. Could it be they all had originated with a common finch ancestor that had somehow been changed and modified into new species? And if so, why did that happen, and how? Could the development of the unique beaks of separate finch species have something to do with the function beaks played in helping each species survive in its own environment? Unfortunately, Darwin had not kept detailed notes about the location where he captured each of his finch specimens. At that time, he didn't realize that the environment where he found a specimen might be an important factor in understanding its development. In a panic, he wrote to Fitzroy to see if the captain knew which islands they had found the different finch species. Luckily, Fitzroy, a careful and detail-oriented military man, had kept accurate notes about the specimens in his own collection. So now, Darwin could look back over Fitzroy's notes and compare the different species of finch to the different places where they lived. When he did, he saw that different Galapagos finch species appeared to have developed on different islands. Geographic isolation, then, appeared to be the mechanism that allowed different species to develop. In other words, Darwin began to believe that finch populations isolated on different islands and living in separate habitats would change over time to better adapt to their own habitat. Could this idea also help to explain why Darwin had seen so many varieties of life, not only in the Galapagos, but in all the places he visited on his voyage? For example, why were there 2 species of fox on each of the 2 major islands in the Falklands, off the Atlantic coast of South America, and a third closely related but entirely separate species of fox found in the Andes Mountains on the Pacific side of South America? Darwin began to wonder if closely related species, like the finches on the Galápagos or the South American foxes, had descended from a common ancestor, but had slowly changed to better fit the environmental conditions where they lived. After all, Charles Lyell had shown that over long periods of time, geological features of the Earth moved and shifted and changed. Lyell had also argued these changes were natural and constantly continuing, even in the present moment. If the land masses and mountains and rivers of the Earth are constantly shifting and changing, wouldn't it make sense to think the same is true of the plants and animals on Earth? Darwin began to be convinced that this was so, and he believed he had a good explanation of why these changes occurred, so that plants and animals would be better adapted to live in their own unique environments. What he still needed was an explanation of how these changes took place.